Reimagining Success, episode 389. In this episode, I want to talk about something subtle that happens in established businesses, the point where the systems, tools, and commitments you set up start running the show without you noticing. So this one's for you if you're busy, reactive, and not quite sure why, because the answer might not be your workload. It might be your infrastructure. Welcome to Reimagining Success, the podcast that helps you build a profitable business as an independent expert, one that works for you and your lifestyle. I'm your host, Anna Lundberg, former corporate insider turned business mentor, executive coach, and mum of two. Whether you're a solopreneur, a coach, speaker, consultant, I'm here to guide you in creating a business that gives you freedom, flexibility, and the fulfillment you're looking for. Ready to redefine success and build a business that you love? Let's get started. There's this moment I've seen in established businesses where the setup that you created to serve you actually starts making decisions for you instead. And it doesn't happen dramatically, it just kind of creeps in over time. So you've built systems, you've hired people, you've made commitments, set up tools, and all very, very sensible at the time. But at some point, those decisions solidified into defaults, and the defaults start to run your week. The question isn't whether you have infrastructure, because we all do, it's just whether you're running it or it's running you. And so I want to give a few different examples that I've seen in clients recently. And the first one is a team member. And so, we're talking here about a solopreneur, independent expert business, but the reality is we have team members who support us, right? You might have a VA, you have a podcast assistant, a graphic designer, someone who works on a particular part of your business. There are all sorts of team members, even if they're freelancers or just working with the ad hoc or however, right? So just to clarify that solo doesn't have to be solo, and you probably know that by now. But this is a team member who starts to set the agenda. So a client of mine had a contractor working on his website, and the contractor was, updating content, making changes, keeping things moving. And every week, the contractor would come to him with questions, with tasks and decisions needed. And obviously, he'd respond, he'd redirect, he'd approve. That feels like normal management, right? But then when we talked about it and asked, if this person wasn't working on the website, would you actually be thinking about the website at all right now? Would these changes be a priority? And the answer was no. The website wasn't a priority. It had everything it needed. Writing all this new stuff and tweaking things and so on just wasn't a priority. But because someone was working on it that he was paying for, mind you, the website kept surfacing as a priority. So he wasn't managing the contractor. In a way, the contractor was managing his attention. And the fix isn't necessarily firing someone in this situation, right? But it's consciously deciding what's actually worth working on and redirecting the resource, in this case, a team member, accordingly. And he gets to decide that. So he had forgotten that he was the boss, that he had hired this person, and he can change the job description. He can change the person, of course, longer term if desired, if needed. And he can get rid of the person altogether if it's not needed. He can change the terms of how to work together, right? That's totally his prerogative, and that is yours too. So that's one example of why the infrastructure, your team member, is setting the agenda. It's classic in corporate, with people setting meetings in your calendar and you're just responding to whatever's in your email inbox instead of setting the priority yourself. Speaking of priorities and meetings and inboxes, the next example is the open calendar. So a lot of solopreneurs, a lot of us will set up a booking link early on. It was one of the first things I did. I have OnceHub, you might have Calendly or whatever the tool that you use. And maybe, and I'm not judging you here, you have left it open. So a lot of my clients have a Calendly link where anyone can book anytime for any reason. And that feels generous and available. And it feels like this is great because they can book and, then we will start working with more clients and so on. But what actually happens is that you're outsourcing your schedule to whoever happens to want your time. There's no filter on who's right for a call. There's no qualification before they book. No sense of whether this is actually a good use of your time. And that's really important. So if you can have someone booking on who just wants to pick your brain, for example, who could never afford your services, who isn't even your ideal client, then by all means, if you're very generous and have all the time in the world and you don't need money, you can have calls with all these people. But if you're like the rest of us, you really need to manage your calendar. The calendar isn't a neutral tool. It's actually a decision-making system. And if you set it up in year one, when you were really hungry for clients and you didn't exactly know who your ideal person was, and you've never revisited it since then you're making year one decisions in year four or year whatever. I learnt that painfully when I had a lot of calls booked in with very poor results early on, and that's something I'd like you to not have to go through. So having some kind of filter mechanism, qualification questionnaire, something at least that kind of gatekeeps your calendar, as an executive would have in corporate. They'd have an assistant who was gatekeeping. So the open calendar is another example. The third one, and I'm sure this is familiar because this is almost every client that I work with, you decided to post on LinkedIn every day or send a weekly email. Or let's say publish a podcast every Monday without fail. And at the time, it makes total sense. Consistency builds audience, showing up really does matter, and you're building momentum. But now that commitment shapes your entire week. So every week you're creating content to honor that commitment, whether or not the content is good, whether or not it's the right commitment, whether or not it's bringing in clients, whether or not it's the best use of your time right now. So the commitment has become the infrastructure, and the infrastructure then is deciding what you work on. So I've recently pulled back on posting every day. I come from a content marketing background. I love writing. It doesn't feel heavy for me to post every day. And yet pumping out kind of vanilla content every day, every week is not necessarily going to move the needle. And in fact, I'm getting better results, believe it or not, at least in terms of impressions and so on, with fewer posts now. And it's not needed, first of all. And secondly, even if it is, it's taking time away from the other things that are arguably more important. And because this becomes your immediate thing, because it's kind of critical path, urgent to get something out today or tomorrow or next week, you feel like you're busy and doing stuff. By the time you get to the important stuff, you're already tired from the energy of having to write all these posts or send the emails or whatever it is, right? So the question again to ask, harking back to my episode last week on renovating versus starting from scratch, if you were starting fresh today, would you make that same commitment? If not, why are you still honouring it? Because maybe when you started out on LinkedIn, it was really important to do a daily post because that got you into the habit. But now you don't need to do that anymore. So again, you don't need my permission, but here is my permission to not keep honouring a commitment that isn't serving you anymore. And the final example is clients. And we'll talk about this more next week, actually. But solopreneurs who've been working with long-term clients for years, and somewhere along the way, the client starts defining the work for you. So requests come in, great, you respond, the scope expands, you absorb it. And the way of working that was set in year one just continues and nobody's revisited it. And in a way, you're now on such good terms that it feels awkward to try to change the terms and conditions and things, right? But what you have to remember is that you're the expert. You have more experience now than when you started with this client, but perhaps you're still operating inside a dynamic that was established when you knew less and needed the work more. So in this case, the infrastructure is the relationship itself, the unspoken norms, the assumed availability, the scope that was never properly defined. So a couple of examples, I won't share names, but a client had exactly this, that so it becomes a bit meta. A client of mine had a client of theirs who, is paying good money, very nice, it's okay work, but just had kind of let this client just do whatever they wanted to, essentially, rather than going, okay, I'm the expert. In my experience, it works best when we do this, and this is how we do that, and first we need to do this step, and here's how we do that, and this is how I work, and, setting both the terms for the work and the nature of the work itself, because you are the subject matter expert, and the terms for hours and response rates and ways of communicating and so on, because it is your business and you get to decide that yourself. So redesigning the client relationship is part of redesigning the business. It doesn't have to be dramatic, right? Oh, and I said I'd share two examples. So the second example is someone I recently spoke with who was saying that she has these wonderful clients that she's been working with for a long time. But again, because it's become quite friendly and it's important work and so on, it's very easy to just say, oh, yes, no problem, I'll do that. underestimating the amount of time it will take. And as we all know, saying yes to one thing means saying no to something else. And it could be no to another client, but more likely it's going to be no to a calm and chilled early evening in bed, or time away from kids, or skipping your gym workout or something like that, right? So really important to remember that you're the expert and you set the scope. So those are some of the examples that I hope you can see where the infrastructure, your team member, employee, your calendar tool, your content commitment, or this final example, your clients, are actually making the decisions for you, instead of, again, if you were to start from scratch, what decisions would you make? So all those examples have the same kind of pattern. A decision that was made at an earlier stage of the business that made sense at the time, no judgment here, but it's since become a default that we're not actually actively choosing. So the business has grown and changed, but the infrastructure hasn't kept up. And because it's infrastructure, background, it's pretty invisible, it's just how things work, it rarely gets examined until something feels heavy and you can't quite work out why. So a few little tips to kind of finish off in terms of what you can actually do about it. First is a bit of an audit. So given those examples I've shared, go through your week and ask for each recurring commitment, each meeting, each task, did I actively choose this week, or is it just happening because it happened last week or last year? Anything that's just happening is worth examining. And it doesn't mean you have to stop it, but it's definitely worth looking into. A few questions for each of those. So 1, does it still serve the business where the business is now? 2, would I set this up the same way if I was starting from scratch, if I was starting fresh? And 3, what would I need to change to make it actually work for me? Okay. And there are tweaks you can make, right? So if it's the client, for example, it doesn't mean you have to tell the client, go away. I don't want to work with you anymore. It doesn't mean you even have to do anything right now, but it can be thinking, okay, next time I take on a client, this is how I'm going to set the boundary from the start. And I'll make sure they're clear on this. And I'll be super well defined on what the scope does and doesn't include. I'll set the terms that this is my response rate, this is how we should communicate, this is how many calls I'll join. A classic thing is that companies tend to treat you like an employee. They forget that you're external and they just start inviting you to meetings. That's quite dangerous, So next client, I'll do things differently. And you can still, with existing clients, check in and say, look, we've been working together for X time. I'm finding that this is working really well with my other clients. Would you be open to, working this way? I'm revisiting my prices because it's been a while and this is now the new rate. You can make the choice to continue with your client at the old rate up until a certain point at least, and then set the new rate for new clients. You can play around with it. You are the boss. This is what's so cool here. But you get to decide that, rather than feeling trapped by the fact that you have been working with the same client, or you set that commitment back in January, or you invested in this tool with an annual subscription or whatever it is, right? So again, as ever, you don't have to blow everything up. But I would suggest that you stop running on defaults that you never consciously chose, or that you did choose for a time, but are no longer serving you for this next stage of your business. Some food for thought. If this episode resonated and you want to get a clearer picture of where your business actually is right now, what's working, what's running on autopilot, and where the real leverage is, I built a free solopreneur diagnostic. You can get that at onestepoutside.com/diagnostic. That's onestepoutside.com/diagnostic. 10 minutes, personalized report, specific next steps. That's onestepoutside.com/diagnostic.